There are a select few people who have fundamentally changed our world and are not yet household names. Karl J. Friston is one of those people. Psychiatrist, neuroscientist, mathematician, physicist, and one of the most impactful research publishers in history, his groundbreaking work has provided many of the most important tools that have made scientific understanding of the brain possible. A fellow of the Royal Society, his impact on the study of the human brain is considered revolutionary. With over 1,600 research papers authored and co-authored, he is in a class of his own. For the past 15 years, Karl has been devoted to the development of the free energy principle, which he and many others believe set out the fundamental principles of how all life is organized. To be alive according to the free energy principle is to act in ways that reduce the gap between your expectations and your sensory inputs. This interview is my humble attempt at a conversation with Karl J. Friston. It's a privilege to have had one of the greatest minds of our time help me explore my fundamental curiosity and wish to better understand why it is that we think the way we think as human beings.
I trained in psychiatry because of a passion for trying to understand how the brain works. So you see this in the anatomy of the brain. So the anatomy of the brain embodies or entails the implicit structure of your world models.
That's 4.5 years of this process of sensing, inferring priors, experimenting, experiencing, and re-updating.
And this picture then gives you a notion of the brain as literally a fantastic organ, in the sense that all of these posterior beliefs are fantasies. It's not artificial intelligence you want, it's natural intelligence. And what you'll get if you apply active inference to artificial intelligence is natural intelligence. What is natural? It's self-evidencing.
Hi, my name is Eric Vautrin, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to my YouTube channel and podcasts. Here, my mission is simple: to have thought provoking conversations with remarkable guests. Together, we'll challenge assumptions, broaden our perspective, and ultimately, my hope is that we will all be called to think with more openness, compassion, and clarity. Your support means the world to me, so please do click on that subscribe button. That way, you'll help me bring even more fantastic guests to my show. I hope you enjoy my next guest. Karl Friston, welcome to Think.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, you're a neuroscientist and theoretician at the University College London. You're an authority on brain imaging and theoretical neuroscience, especially the use of physics inspired statistical methods to model neuroimaging data and other random dynamical systems. Now, normally I introduce my guests by sharing a little bit about their professional and personal journeys and their accomplishments. But in all honesty, if I did that in your case, I think we would spend the first 10 minutes just going through everything that you have done in your life and in your career up until now. Looking at your profile on the University College London website, I think you've authored or co-authored like 1,600 plus papers that are listed there. And the list of accomplishments and awards surpass my understanding of what it is that you do. It is a quite large and extensive list of things that you have done. So let's rather start with a very simple question. What would you like my viewers and listeners to know about you as we start this nice conversation together?
That's an excellent question. I'm a trained psychiatrist, but trained in psychiatry because of a passion for trying to understand how the brain works. And to prepare myself for that understanding, I committed to studying physics and probability theory as a young man. So I'm at a very early foundational stage, doubly qualified as a physicist or a biomathematician and a clinical neuropsychiatrist. I haven't seen patients for many, many decades. I sort of worry about students nowadays as opposed to patients. But the agenda of the research that I pursue is always slightly constrained by that clinical aspect. If you want to understand how people suffer or are dysfunctional in terms of their neurology or their psychiatric presentation, then it's important to understand how normal people work so you can understand the mechanisms, the pathologies that lead to false inferences, improper kind of sense making. So that journey, in terms of understanding how the brain works, was a fortuitous journey in the sense that I was able to study neurology and psychiatry um, until my 30s, and then was privileged to be involved in a team of young scientists that were contending the problems presented by brain imaging. So I just happened to be around when the technology afforded the opportunity to look inside the brain using brain scanning techniques. And that generated big data, and we had to make sense of those big data. And I was one of the key people involved in the modeling and the analysis of those data. And interestingly, exactly the same tools and principles that you bring to bear to make sense of these imaging data are usefully applied to how we and our brains make sense of our visual information, our auditory information, indeed our literally our gut feelings, our interoception. So it was an easy move for me to make to redeploy a lot of the usually Bayesian principles that we used to make sense of empirical scientific data as a metaphor for how we make sense of our sensory data. The story there being that we are essentially all little scientists performing experiments on the world, literally securing data, soliciting data by moving our eyes or palpating the world in a particular way, either by moving our bodies or indeed by, say, Googling this or Googling that, seeking out the right kind of information to make the best sense of the world around us. And that led to a synthesis of these principles and boiling it down to the simplest kind of expression, mathematical expression of this kind of sense making and active sense making in terms of the free energy principle. And an application of that was active inference, a kind of active, a formulation or description of how we actively sample our world in order to understand it in the service of how best next to sample that world. So there's an implicit circular causality inherent in this application of the free energy principle, namely active inference. And in recent years, that's what I spend most of my time simulating, talking about, thinking about, simplifying and refining that first principle approach that inherits from my very early physics training to understanding sentient behavior and elaborating a physics of sentience.
Well, I'm very grateful that you actually do spend a lot of time speaking about the free energy principle and active inference. I've been able to watch quite a few of your YouTube interviews. You're very generous in that sense. So you allow someone like myself who does not have at all a physics neuroscience background to try and grasp um, the free energy principle, active inference, what it means in terms of trying to understand ourselves as humans and how we function. And of course, there are quite a few people who have taken on the free energy principle and then added some layers to it or some interpretation in terms of how that may connect to other areas like emotions or even what Freud was talking about, transference and these kinds of things. And I'm really interested to get into all of that. For my viewers, I wonder, because mostly I have a business background for the last 15 years. A lot of people will be listening to this who come from the corporate world. I just want to maybe start with some of the basics in terms of my understanding at a very simplified level, Bayesian and Bayesian inference. The example that I tend to give and tell me if I'm off is, well, if I'm walking down the street, for example, and I see someone from behind and the person has long hair, is wearing a short skirt, high heels, and a purse, my brain will assume that that is a woman. Now, if I'm in downtown Montreal, I'm originally from Canada. We have a part of the city called the Gay Village. I'm in that part of the city and I see someone from behind and they have long hair, they're wearing high heels, a skirt, and a purse, my brain will not assume that that is a biologically born woman because there's another set of conditions that it's considering to try and figure out what it is that is in its environment. And then I may say, okay, well, maybe it's a transgender, transsexual, or a woman, but I don't know yet. I cannot infer based on the information that I have. Would that be a very basic explanation of Bayesian inference? Or can you make it maybe even a bit prettier for my listeners and the viewers to understand?
I don't think I can make it any prettier, and it's interesting that you choose a potentially pretty man or woman to illustrate. Well, that was a beautiful illustration of Bayesian inference, and it brings to the table a couple of sort of key concepts. First of all, you've got two kinds of things in play. You've got sensory evidence, the data that you gather, um, the sensations that you use to build beliefs about what is causing your sensations. So you've got the visual impression of the man or the woman from behind, but you also have prior beliefs. So before you saw that sensory evidence, a priori, you had beliefs about the probability of it being a man or a woman. Um, and just notice that in having the very notion of objecthood that could be ascribed the attribute of male or female,
Hmm.
that's quite a thing. That's something that you have learned, which speaks to you as quite a remarkable little scientist or Bayesian machine, in the sense that not only do you have this fine-grained classification of different types of people, but you have a notion of people, and that may speak to the fact you have a notion of self. This is quite fundamental.
Hmm.
You would not imagine that a virus would have this capacity. If a virus was exposed to the sensory consequences of being proximate to a person, but
Mm-hmm.
you immediately try to make sense of these impressions, say, "Oh, it's a person. What kind of person?" The prior beliefs that you talked about, um, in your particular example, also reveal another aspect, that they're very context sensitive. So
Mm-hmm.
your prior beliefs that you bring to the table, that you use to contextualize and make the most of the sensory information, depend upon the context in which you find yourself, whether you're in um, you're a gay part of Canada, or whether you're in the streets of London. That provides a particular context which has a profound influence on your priors, and your priors then are going to be admixed or combined with the sensory evidence according to Bayes' rule, so that you now have a belief after seeing the sensory information, and that's called a posterior belief, or more simply a Bayesian belief. So that's a really nice example that I think quite crucially introduces this context sensitivity that we have to deal with. We have to know the context in which we are gathering information, and thereby contextualize our priors in a way that provides the right kind of model for the world that we are sampling. And sometimes people refer to the combination of what's called a likelihood and a prior as a world model. So put them together, you've now got a complete model of your lived world, or at least your sensed world, that constitutes a likelihood and a prior. And then you put those two together, and then you get a posterior belief from after seeing the information.
Which will then, I guess, adjust the prior or become part of the prior for a future experience which may have similar conditions. And
Absolutely. Well, yeah, sorry to interrupt, but that's a really
of
important
course.
point. Yeah, so that adjustment is called Bayesian belief updating, and that's that little phrase um, can cover a lot, if one could argue everything about just existing in our world.
Hmm.
So one way of describing Bayesian belief updating is that um, today's posteriors become tomorrow's priors. So I have seen this image of what would in a typical situation be a woman. I now have a posterior belief. Well, this is probably going to be a woman. It's not concrete, but it's a sort of probabilistic or Bayesian belief, which is a posterior. And if I now were to walk past him or her and glance over my shoulder, I now would have a prior belief that I'm expecting to see, if I was on the streets of London, a woman's face. So now what I've done is sometime later, I've used my posteriors as priors now to make sense of new information, which would be afforded by a direct gaze towards the person's face. You can generalize this notion of Bayesian belief updating to everything, not just beliefs about the state of the world out there generating my sensations. In this instance, there is a person next to me and he or she is now generating data, but also beliefs of a subpersonal sort, beliefs about the contingencies and the association, the natural laws that underwrite the structure, the causal structure of our universe. And that would be called learning. So as we update the structure or the parameters, more specifically within the structure of our world or generative models, slowly over time as we become wiser and accumulate knowledge, then we're now updating more slowly the parameters, the variables that describe the associations and contingencies within our world models. You could also argue at a very, very slow time scale, there's an updating process which pertains not to the parameters or the strengths of associations in our world models or our generative models, but the very structure itself. Is there, is my world populated by people, and are people divided into different genders, and within different genders are there different individuals and different personality types? So increasingly fine-grained structures, and you could argue that this kind of belief updating would be apt to describe, say, neurodevelopment since birth, or you could even describe it in terms of natural selection or Bayesian model selection at an evolutionary level. So this notion of Bayesian belief updating, using today's posteriors as tomorrow's priors, is incredibly important in understanding at different temporal scales how we navigate and or at least how we can describe our navigation of our sensed world.
And the way that you layered it, so in my example, I was already at, person, man, woman, biological. But as you said, there's person, there's object is person. There's so many layers of inference and learning and that cycle. And it actually reminds me that, so my wife and I, we have 4.5-year-old twins. And a couple of weeks ago, we were in the backyard and I was throwing a ball to my son. And now he's catching it more regularly. And catching looks simple. It feels simple for an adult, but being a parent and seeing from being a baby born and through that process to actually get to catching a ball regularly, that's 4.5 years of this process of sensing, inferring priors, experimenting, experiencing, and re-updating. It's quite, I mean, mathematically, it may sound simple to a listener or viewer, but to see it in action as a biological thing and experience is quite magnificent, actually, that's the way that we function and how we grow as human beings.
Yeah, absolutely. And then two points, really important points from that lovely example. First of all, this sort of layering and nesting as we more and more fine grain and construct a sort of detailed explanation. So that kind of layered explanation is manifest in the very structure of our generative models, referred to as a hierarchical generative model, or more simply a deep model, in the sense that it has hierarchical depth. So you see this in the anatomy of the brain. So the anatomy of the brain embodies or entails the implicit structure of your world models. So you see cortical hierarchies in the brain that do exactly this sort of successive nesting generalization as you move up the hierarchy, or unpacking and specializing and becoming more domain specific as you move down the hierarchy, right to the level of the sensory organs or the sensory epithelium, just unpacking. The other nice aspect of that example of catching a ball, one could argue that the most important kinds of natural experiments a baby has to perform in order to make sense of her world is to disambiguate what she can cause as opposed to what's caused by mother or somebody else or the laws of physics. So just learning that I am an embodied person and
Mm.
that I can move and that I am the cause of my sensations is quite remarkable. As you say, it's a magnificent feat that within a few years, if not a few weeks or months, in terms of very early neonatal development, that babies can accrue and learn world models where they can, they have an understanding that mother may well be a thing, an object, and
Hmm.
perhaps the baby itself is a thing or an object, and the baby can influence the world by crying or screaming, and then many years later actually get an intuitive physics in her head to enable her to catch balls and ultimately ride bicycles and become airline pilots in later life. I mean, this is quite remarkable.
It is, and I did my best to read your paper, Hierarchically Mechanistic Mind, yeah, which clearly describes sort of this layering, and also the error correction mechanisms within active inference. Um, Now, if I can try to describe to my listeners, my understanding of active inference is basically, or the free energy principle, it's the brain tries to predict its own experience before it has it. And the closer the experience is to the prediction, the better, because the less energy consumption. And as sentient beings, we can act on our environment to ignore, to change it in order to try and bring that experience as close as possible to the prediction. Would that be a very, let's say, layman explanation and understanding of the free energy principle?
Yeah, well, I think it would be beyond layman. That's the kind of explanation you find in a fairly fluent philosophical or narrative account of the free energy principle. So I think it's absolutely spot on. If you allow me, I'll just sort of paraphrase what you just said in a number of different ways, just to join the dots,
Absolutely.
because people do describe the free energy principle in words that don't sound very similar, but in fact they're all mathematically exactly the same. So this sort of you've got absolutely the essence of this, that it's all about scoring the mismatch between what I predict in the moment and what I'm actually experiencing, um, and changing anything that I can change in order to resolve that mismatch. So, in neurophilosophy, for example, and in the philosophical literature on predictive processing, this would be described as minimizing precision-weighted prediction errors. So, that disparity or that divergence or the difference between what I predict in the moment and what I'm actually sensing is the prediction error.
Mm.
So, the name of the game, and I should just say it's weighted by the precision, and that's you slipped in there that I can attend or not attend. So you just multiply the prediction error by a large precision if you want to attend to that and minimize that, or you can ignore it by multiplying it by zero with very
Mm.
small precision. Technically, the precision is just the confidence that you place in this kind of information. What is its signal to noise? So if I'm in the
Mhm.
dark, I'm going to assign a very low precision to my visual input, but I may increase the precision or attend to my auditory input or my tactile input as I'm feeling my way around a dark room or a room with my eyes closed. Um, so one way of understanding hierarchical inference in the brain, or inference, perceptual inference and active inference under deep generative models, is in terms of trying to minimize prediction error. And you use the prediction error to adjust your posterior beliefs in exactly the way we were talking about before. So this is the Bayesian belief updating. It is the prediction error that is doing the Bayesian belief updating by sending messages deeper into the hierarchy to update and adjust the neuronal representations that encode these posterior beliefs about what cause my sensations. And this picture then gives you a notion of the brain as literally a fantastic organ, in the sense that all of these posterior beliefs are fantasies, they're hypotheses, they're best guesses, they're explanations that could be fit for purpose for explaining what I'm actually sensing. And I'm just going to adjust and update my Bayesian fantasies until I now have the best explanation. What is the best explanation? Well, that which minimizes the prediction error on the precision
Hmm.
weighting. Another way of reading prediction errors is in terms of surprise. So if I get a big prediction error, then I will mathematically be experiencing surprise. I'm surprised at this sensory input. Free energy can be read really as a measure of surprise. So if I'm always in the game of minimizing surprise, then I can be described mathematically as minimizing my free energy. One final twist here,
Hmm.
which I think is insightful, is that the negative surprise is mathematically the evidence for your model of the world, which means while I'm trying to minimize free energy or minimize surprise, I am also effectively trying to maximize the evidence for my models of the world. And that leads to the notion of self-evidencing. So you
Hmm.
can think of active inference as basically you and I and your twins actively securing sensory information and evidence from the world in the service of gathering evidence for their own models of the world.
Hmm.
If they do so successfully, they implicitly have a better and better model of the world.
Hmm.
And because they've got a better and better model with the world, they can now engage with that world. They can navigate that world in a way which is harmonious, surprise-free, and as you say, minimizes the free energy. Does that make
And
sense?
to me, it does. And it also leads to this reflection that I had, which is for the brain, there's no good or bad in the sense that if I have a habit which is even self destructive, which can be harming my body, be harming myself, if that's the pattern which is predicted to, let's say, to be the most accurate thing that's going to happen in that context, my brain doesn't say it's good, it's bad for me. It's really a prediction game, and I'm more likely to do that thing even if it has negative effects on my liver or my back or my stomach. So really the surprise and negative surprise, I think people should not take as maybe what we think of as good feelings or a healthy lifestyle, but really a set of patterns that I guess have developed starting very young, right? And that have then been reinforced, and that we have a system that wants to confirm its own model as often as possible in as many situations as possible, because that reduces the energy expenditure of changing the model, updating the predictions, and having a different way of interacting with the world. I mean, it's a little bit philosophical, but I think for our brain as an organ, good, bad, right, wrong is not something which is neurologically part of its makeup. Would that be accurate?
No, I think that's a really important point. Yeah, there is no goodness or wrongness. I mean, you can have a, an active inference-like theory of morals, but you're absolutely right. The only objective function that matters is the evidence for your models of your lived world. And those models can be very, very complicated and deeply structured and deeply layered, and they include models of a world that is populated by things like me and people who are not like me. So, everything, and models of me in different emotional states, for example. So, that's the only goodness is the evidence. Technically, it's also known as the marginal likelihood of your sensations given your model. Um, and on that view, if maximizing evidence is minimizing surprise, then surprise then is bad in the sense that it is the only objective function. But then you have to ask the question, is that the kind of badness that I would feel if I had some angst, or if I thought this was ego dystonic? You can't answer that question unless you presuppose that your generative model has a model of ego and what is syntonic and not syntonic. And of course, those are just the prior beliefs about the kinds of things that you would encounter. So I think it's a really important point. There is no measure of adaptive fitness. There is no measure of goodness. There's no measure of value other than the evidence for you as part of this ecosystem or part of an eco niche, with which you engage. Could I just go back to, because I the way that you framed that divergence and sort of a mismatch,
Hmm.
I think was also just emphasize the active aspect,
Hmm.
uh, which I think is important. That you sort of implied that there are two ways of minimizing surprise or maximizing evidence. I can either change my mind by updating my beliefs so that my predictions become more like my sensations,
Hmm.
or I can act upon the world to
Hmm.
get some different sensations that are more like my predictions. So I think that's a very important insight. That's the active bit of active inference, that being able not just to adjust to the world as it is, but also minimizing prediction error or surprise by changing the world to conform to my predictions. In that simple sense, to come back to your last point, at a very subpersonal level, what we've just described is homeostasis. So, this
Hmm.
notion that we behave in a way to elude surprising physiological states, it's just homeostasis. It's just resolving those physiological prediction errors that say I'm too hot or too cold, my blood sugar is not quite what I want. I mean, we don't know we're doing this, but from a subpersonal point of view, this is what the brain is doing. It's simply generalizing this notion of homeostasis to resolve the prediction error, which are excursions away from the kind of thing that we are.
And I think for those listening, when we say act upon the external world, it doesn't mean that it's a conscious thing that we are aware of, that we are acting on the world in order for that experience to be closer to the prediction. I think in one of your papers, you even go into eye movements and how eyes can move then differently to sample something else and so on and so forth. So it's not like I'm making this conscious choice. And I'm very interested to get to consciousness and human agency as part of this exploration. So these things are happening, but at a level that we consciously are most probably not aware of. One example that comes to mind, which I don't know if it fits, but Freud talked about transference, how we can have an emotional experience with someone, but that emotion doesn't belong to that person or that experience, in the sense that it's from our parents, it's from a brother, it's from a very early experience, but the intensity of the emotion that we then have with our spouse is not related to that spouse. And in my mind, if I take the free energy principle and active inference, is, well, yeah, the brain is just ignoring or adjusting or sort of acting on the world to take out the part of who it is who's in front of me, because it already predicted that this is how I'm going to feel and this is the experience that I'm having, and forget the rest, however the mechanism is, to make sure that that doesn't become part of this whole mechanism of prediction experience and priors and post adjustments.
Yeah, again, you brought some excellent examples to the table there. I'm not sure where to start. You've talked about consciousness, you talked about emotion, we've talked about dyadic interactions
And
uh,
human agency.
and agency. So where do we
Yes.
start with all that? Let's just start at the top. The notion, and you phrase that wonderfully. You know, I, and what I heard was that I am having this interaction with my wife. I now not only do I have a world model or a generative model in which I am an agent, but I'm also an agent in different states of mind, and these could have an emotional attribute.
Hmm.
So that's part of my world model. What kind of mood am I in at the moment? What are my feelings? And not everybody has this. I mean, there are people with you know severe alexithymia that just do not experience emotions in the same way that you and I might experience. So this again is a gift. It's this other sort of fine graining, having a model that can recognize, infer, perceive different emotional states from bodily sensations and from um, extrapersonal, extraceptive sensations that suggest a particular context and a particular interaction with one or many others. So, just knowing that there are certain sort of things out there like you and me that can have this very, very expressive generative model that includes not just selfhood, but different kinds of emotional states, I think is quite a deep insight. And, just from a very simple-minded Bayesian perspective, um, if you have built a model of me in a particularly emotionally charged situation,
Hmm.
which contextualizes the way that I act upon the world. At a very simple level, for example, if I am experiencing a racing heart and I am seeing a dark alley in a strange town, then I might infer I am anxious. So the best explanation for these interoceptive gut feelings and these exteroceptive visual inputs, and perhaps I'm hearing footsteps behind me. So
Hmm.
there's a lot of um, information that when I have to find an explanation for this, a hypothesis that explains this myriad, this particular combination of sensory evidence, I might say, oh, I am anxious. And of course, if I am anxious, then I expect to have a racing heart. So I can actively now accelerate my heart rate in preparation for either freezing or flight or fight. Um,
Hmm.
and I will recognize this as being anxious. It's me in an anxious state that has consequences in terms of my um, changing my or acting upon the world. But notice here, the world at this point, at the point of just becoming anxious in the situation, my action is not on the outside world. It's on the world that is my body. It's my
Hmm.
embodied world, my uh, um, interoceptive world. So that I think speaks to an important notion of to have emotions means you have to have had experiences that very much like learning to catch the ball, you've carved your emotional states of being in a
Hmm.
particular way because of early experience. And of course, you're going to call these hypotheses to the table if you encounter a similar situation with your wife as opposed to your naughty brother, who's upsetting you at age 2 or 3, because you've learned this structure, and this is
Hmm.
the most apt explanation for all your bodily sensations and the nature of the interaction with your wife in this context, even though your wife is not your little brother. It's the same scenario. You can bring the same hypothesis to the table, and it works. This is the nature of living with other people. They can sometimes cause a certain bodily and emotional state and intentional stance. So you have to have that, otherwise you would be alexithymic. You would be like a
Hmm.
robot. You could even argue you're like somebody who was suffering from very severe autism that didn't
Hmm.
have quite the theory of mind simply because they didn't have a well-formed sense of self in different emotional states, and all the implications that might entail. So we mentioned, we've still got consciousness and agency to do, but
Yeah.
they are, if you like, entailed or subsumed. Just to have um, a world model or a generative model in which um, that has selfhood, I think implies that you are an agent. To be
Hmm.
an agent, you have to have a world model or a generative model that includes the consequences of your action. And by action, I mean anything, either covert action attending to this or attending to that,
Hmm.
introspective action, autonomic reflexes, or motor action using smooth muscles to actually move either my eyes or or walk or talk. Um,
Hmm.
many, many ways that we can act upon the world. But, well, in fact, they're not. We can only secrete something or move a muscle, but we can do it in many, many different contexts. Um, but the important thing here is that to be an agent is to have a world model that includes the consequences of your action. And there's a
Hmm.
slight twist in that,
Okay.
because if the consequence of your action is not immediately available, it has to be in the future. So immediately to have emotions as an agent with a minimal selfhood entails agency. Agency entails a world model of the consequences of action.
Hmm.
Therefore, it must entail a world model of the future. So now you're talking about
Hmm.
very special kinds of things. which are not thermostats or viruses, or you could even argue bacteria, that have a model that is free from the present, simply
Hmm.
because it has to have that in order to predict what will happen in the future. So
Hmm.
previously we talked about prediction in the moment, but now we're talking about predicting the consequences of action, where the sensory consequences have not yet been made available. And this leads you into a whole new world of active inference. And then you ask, well, what are the imperatives that underwrite that kind of action? And interestingly, if we come back to surprise as a way of conceiving of this free energy or negative log evidence, then you will, if you want to minimize surprise in the moment, but now you want to choose actions that minimize the surprise you expect consequent on this action or that action, then you're trying to minimize expected surprise. And
Hmm.
mathematically, expected surprise is uncertainty. So what that means is that we spend all of our lives acting in a way to resolve uncertainty, which means we're just curious, which explains why you're talking to me and why I'm talking to you, trying to
Yes.
work out what you want me to say next.
And I know I recently listened to a conversation you had with someone on their podcast, and you're talking about bring two people together or a group together. It's free or active inference to the nth degree, because everyone is trying to predict and they're adjusting their predictions all simultaneously around one another to try to function, yeah, within that environment as a group, or to have a conversation even, which is majestic in a way, right? That is even possible, that we have that experience, and what is actually, or what we think is actually going on simultaneously in all of these human bodies and beings at the same time, is something that I I find sometimes now oversimplify or discount as just our lived experience. And I work in organizational change management a lot to help organizations to change the company culture, digitalize, their environment, and then help people along the journey. And they seem to think that change management or changing people is like project management for human beings. That there's a very simple method that you can follow in order to get people engaged and motivated and performant. Um, but if I take the idea of the free energy principle and everyone's context and their priors and everything that's going on in and of itself, that we manage to do what we do together as human beings is a feat, I would say, which we should be in awe of. Um, and then I wonder where my experience, my consciousness comes in. So we talked a little bit agent and agency, and therefore we have an ability to construct a world that doesn't yet exist in our head. It's the next moment, it's the next day, it's the future, it's the consequences of our actions. I read last year, and I really wanted to ask you about this, that there was a two I have to read here that two guys in Germany had a bet, right? I think he was a neuroscientist, Christoph Koch was his name, and a philosopher, David Chalmers. They bet 25 years ago. So the neuroscientist, that we would prove that consciousness is located within the brain, and the philosopher said, "No way, not going to happen." And supposedly they met last year after 25 years, and the neuroscientist paid the philosopher, yeah, the amount of the bet, because we have not yet proven that consciousness emanates or is located within the brain. And I think you're probably the right person to ask if that is where we are in the state of our understanding of consciousness.
Well, yeah, I think that bit of theatre with David Chalmers and Christoph Koch was a nice, if you like, flag to attract the community's attention to the question that people are wrestling with in this field. Um, it was great theatre, and yeah, I think we can actually connect what you were just saying about sort of organization and governance to that question, because um, it having a sense of self, which you could say was an important or a necessary part of a generative model if you were conscious of yourself. Um, may rest upon the fact that you need to disambiguate between self and other, or more specifically, are the consequences that I'm seeing or hearing or feeling caused by you or by me?
Mm.
And as soon as you have other things like me in your environment, in your niche, then there's a slight pressure to have the good generative models that have the largest evidence that are fit for purpose for explaining this kind of environment. It would be necessary for you now to hold in your head the fact that there are other things like me, and as soon as you do that, now you have the capacity to be able to infer agency and attribution. So I think consciousness probably emerges in and only in things that have to attribute agency in the context of being around similar things. So there may be an argument that if you were on Mars and there were no other conspecifics that you could plausibly ascribe the cause of a consequence of anything that you did, you wouldn't need a concept of other.
Mm.
You wouldn't need a concept of self. You probably wouldn't need consciousness. But of course, we are not in that game. We are in the game of dealing with a cultural niche that is comprised largely of people and artifacts that people make. And as such, there's a great pressure now on being able to attribute things to self and other. And I think that's a key aspect of the kind of self-consciousness. It's not consciousness per se, but
Mm-hmm.
certainly the aspects of consciousness that pertain to attribution and intention and self-consciousness, being aware that of me as a person. So I think there's a really nice connection between the two. I should also say I liked your revisiting how to manage people by avoiding project management. I mean, a group of people is just the perfect scenario to think about what are the natural laws that underwrite self-organization.
Mm-hmm.
And any ensemble of things that self-organize are going to find their free energy minima. If they attain a kind of non-equilibrium steady state. If they don't exist as that group anymore. They
Mm.
dissipate, they decay, they die. What is that joint free energy minima? It's just mutual predictability, as you say. So it's
Mm-hmm.
just learning about each other and being able to infer what will happen if I do that in terms of what you will do, and try to find some shared common ground and some shared language to render ourselves mutually predictable. And all I have to do is to infer, are you like me or not? And if you're
Mm-hmm.
like me, then I can assume you're using my kind of generative model, and therefore we're mutually predictable. We can communicate, we speak the same language. Dynamically, we can attain some kind of generalized synchrony, and we minimize our joint free energy. So I think that will be the kind of mechanics you bring to the table to enable and understand good, cohesive, together, distributed kind of communication and intelligence in a group of people. But coming back to consciousness, is it in the brain? Yeah, I think most people would say it is in the brain. So I suspect that David Chalmers was more has the hard question been answered? Um, and Christoph Koch, as a neuroscientist, probably acknowledged no, it's not quite yet. So there are a number of answers out there. So you're taking me beyond my comfort zone now. So I always have to qualify this by saying I am not a consciousness researcher. I have no
Mm-hmm.
philosophical training. However, I do have lots of friends who are. So I can give you a few hypotheses that are currently being entertained about consciousness and its in its sort of vernacular or sort of usual usage. And you can pick out one to see if you like it. So one approach would be to say that to be conscious entails some kind of inner action, some internal action. And indeed, you could take that further and say to be conscious is to be an agent, to
Mm-hmm.
act, to have the capacity to act. So if it's overt action, that means that we don't see, we look. We don't hear, we listen.
Mm.
So it puts agency and action right at the front, in terms of what it means to be conscious and to have qualitative experience. So what this basically means is, if I don't look at something, I won't see it. So I have to actively look at it.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a number of experiments and adversarial research collaborations currently in play, funded by the Templeton Foundation, to actually test that particular hypothesis experimentally. But the action doesn't have to be overt, it could be covert. And what is covert action? Well, it comes right back to what we were talking about before, which is this precision weighting of the prediction errors. It's attention. So
Mm-hmm.
there may be a deep link between the capacity to act upon the deeply layered generative models in our head covertly, that would not be seen from the outside, from
Mm-hmm.
outside the skull. That would constitute a kind of mental action, and that would qualify you as an agent. And it may well be that in deploying that kind of mental action, and that kind of agency, there is, if you like, manifesting the process of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and that story is generally unpacked in relation to um, phenomenology and phenomenal transparency and opacity. So acting on the inside enables you to render what was transparent, I'm just experiencing it, opaque. So now I know I'm looking at something.
Mm-hmm.
And that may be a sort of bright line between sort of different kinds of qualitative experience that may speak to consciousness. There are lots of other really interesting hypotheses. One which you will find in neuropsychoanalysis, um, which sort of inherits to a certain extent from Freudian constructs, but if you like, brought into the 21st century in terms of sort of free energies and the like, is proposed by Mark Soames. And he says that this, this attentional aspect that is mediated by the representation of uncertainty or precision in terms of what to attend to or what to ignore, what to realize,
Mm-hmm.
enable in terms of my belief updating, is the key to feelings of a sentient sort. So
Mm-hmm.
he'd put the seat of consciousness with the cells of origin of the brain, the nerve cells that release these precision encoding, attention mediating like neurotransmitters. And he's got lots of really interesting empirical evidence for this. That I can switch off your consciousness if you won't allow me to do this, but if I could, I could identify a little subcortical area right in the center of your brain that that houses the cells that give origin to nerve fibers that broadcast these precision weighting attentional mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
And if I were able to just quell or quench the activity of this little tiny little region of the brain, you'd lose consciousness just like that. And in fact, it's if you're an anesthesiologist or anaesthetist in the UK, you could actually do this using sort of electrical stimulation.
Mm.
So that I don't think consciousness is quite as mysterious as David Chalmers might suppose. You can actually find the sort of 21st century version of the pineal gland and switch it on and off at will, and it's exactly the same kind of mechanism that you will experience when you're falling asleep. So
Mm.
you must have the experience, you're watching a very long podcast or lecture, and suddenly you find yourself drifting off, and these cells sort of stop, they're firing away, and they go, bop, 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 and off you go. So there are physical mechanisms in the brain that control consciousness, or certainly the consciousness as a process that goes through many different sort of aspects, say in sleep or
Mm-hmm.
in coma and the like. There are other theories that actually very consistent with that, speaking to the things like global neuronal workspace theories and the like, which have a more um, cortical focus. And by cortex, I mean the parts of the brain which sit much more towards the surface that we associate with processing memories and vision and audition and movement. Um, and possibly to a certain extent feelings and the like. Um, these theories really try to identify, well, what are the minimal brain structures that would be necessary for consciousness. So more recently, my colleague Chris Fields and other colleagues in Adam Saffron and Maxwell Ramsted and many others are looking at at certain systems in the brain, technically, that have irreducible Markov blankets that are unique. They can't be divided. They don't have any deep structure or layered structure within them. And that's interesting because that means they can't represent themselves, but they can represent the rest of the brain. So it may be that these minimal irreducible Markov blankets in the brain may be, and you can identify them just by using anatomical connectivity tracing studies, may be, if you like, the anatomical correlate, or the place where the process of consciousness um, um, uh, proceeds or is evinced in some way. I'm sure I've forgotten other theories of consciousness, but there are lots of them. Mathematically, the free energy principle sort of does provide a way out of this dualism
Okay.
that usually attends these debates in a very simple way. So the free energy principle we just said is basically a statement that you can write down the maths of things that self-organize in the spirit of self-evidencing. In other words, they look as if they are um, encoding beliefs about the outside world in a way that they're trying to minimize the surprise or maximize the evidence for their for for the data that they get in relation to those beliefs. What that means technically is there are two ways of reading the state of a brain in terms of, say, activation in different parts of the brain or the firing of nerve cells that constitute neuronal dynamics that control all our movements and our homeostasis and the like. There are two ways of reading that neuronal state. You can either look at the statistics of the neuronal states themselves, of the kind that we would look at using brain imaging or electrophysiology,
Mm-hmm.
or you can look at the statistics of the beliefs about external states in the world. So this means that the same substrate, namely the internal states of my brain and your brain,
Yeah.
has two probabilistic interpretations. One, the probability of those states,
Mm-hmm.
and the probability encoded by those states about other states. And it may be that, if you like,
Mm.
dual reading of a brain state is the way to repair Cartesian dualism, leading to a dual aspect monism, which to my mind is a fairly simple and mathematical way of resolving the the sort of Cartesian debates.
So it's both and at the same time in that sense.
Yeah, and one entails the other. Yeah.
Does that um I think where it was leading me also around the free energy principle and consciousness and agency is the question of my own reflections about my choices or my decisions and my interaction in on a daily basis or in the world. Is that actually um, am I an agent there, or have the predictions been made? Uh, the outcome almost been predetermined, and the consciousness is sort of something which is not necessary to that process of prediction and minimization of surprise, let's say, and what the brain needs in order to function within this world. If I understood it correctly, it does then, yeah, consciousness and my own interoception and my own, let's say, inner dialogue and my own reflections on my thoughts that are coming up and my environment would in essence still be part of this whole prediction and Bayesian inference mechanism. So I still do have some agency, and my consciousness and my own experience of myself and my choices is something valid within my functioning within the free energy principle, if I understood that correctly.
Yeah, no, I think that's very insightful. Yeah, you know, and again, it speaks to the importance of having a generative model that is free from the present, so you can have this counterfactual inner life, which you
Hmm.
have to have in order to plan. It's really, really, very, very simple. There are things out there that plan, and there are things out there that don't plan, and there's a lot of wonderful biotic self-organization from viruses through to, say, small insects that don't have to plan. They
Hmm.
just have homeostasis. They just reflexively minimize the surprise in the moment, job done.
Hmm.
Whereas things like you and me that can actually entertain counterfactual futures and select amongst those futures because we are the agents of those futures. We are the authors of those counterfactual futures, and we can select the one that minimizes expected surprise.
Hmm.
Then we have this inner life. And of course, if we're looking at our brains, these deeply layered structures, uh, enacting these inner lives, then a natural hypothesis that explains what's going on is that, oh, I am thinking. Oh, I am conscious. Oh, I have qualitative experience. And then all the puzzles that ensue from why do I have qualitative experience? Then ultimately you get a philosopher. Yeah, yeah. So this is a line taken by um, Andy Clark, who somewhat dismisses the hard problem uh, and joins with David Chalmers in actually addressing the meta problem, sometimes as the meta hard problem. Um, I'm not sure whether they're still doing that, but certainly a couple of years ago. So the meta problem is, why do people puzzle so much about consciousness? Why do they puzzle about and and I think that's a more interesting question, and I think they puzzle about it because of this recursion.
Hmm.
Oh, I see myself thinking. I see myself um, introspecting. And I see myself as a self. Why? And of course, there's an infinite recursion that is impossible to read. So the argument you end up with that all of those glorious words that you find in consciousness research um, and the philosophy of mind, such as qualia and qualitative experience, and such as consciousness of various sorts, these are just fantasies and hypotheses in exactly the same way as the subpersonal reflexes that we talk about underwrite our homeostasis, or the subpersonal
Hmm.
beliefs that your daughter has when catching a ball.
Yeah.
There's nothing. There's nothing. They're just part of a generative model. It's just the generative model that is particularly nuanced in philosophers who
Hmm.
talk about this. You won't find a neonate or a worrying about puzzling about the hard problem. Uh, so I think that's quite insightful, just to say that it's just part of our world model. Philosophy is part of our world model. You could argue maths is, and you could argue the free energy principle is as well. It's
Hmm.
just part of. It's just a fantasy. It's part of our world model, and you'll never know. Because of this soplistic aspect of being locked inside our skulls, generating fantasies about what's going on out there.
Hmm.
You'll never know. You first person will never know the answer. More importantly, you'll never know about me. So the free energy principle, from the point of view of a physicist,
Yeah.
tells you explicitly that all that you will ever know about me is what you can see on my surface, on my Markov boundary, on my
Hmm.
um, in my exchange with the world. So
Yeah.
as you measure me, all you can see is basically the consequences of my actions upon the world.
Hmm.
So you can never ever know whether I am even doing active inference, let alone being conscious. It's unknowable by definition. Um, so, the best you can do is tell stories about as if from a first person perspective.
Hmm.
Um, you know, and I think the story you told is probably the best story. Yeah.
And that's really a very powerful reflection on the fact that you cannot know the actual experience of someone else, because all that you have is the external interaction of that person in front of you and your own perception of it, which is affected by your own priors and so you will never have that full experience or understanding. And for people who don't know, the Markov blanket who are listening, my understanding at a very basic level is if we take the brain itself doesn't experience anything, in a sense. It doesn't have senses. It's not fingers, it's not eyes, it's the brain. And there is this separation, this Markov blanket, which it then, that's what it sees, and the senses end up on the other side of that blanket, and that's sort of the barrier between the experience, right, of the brain and its external world. And I think the allegory of the cave is one thing that I read as an example of the Markov blanket. So you see the shadows on the wall, but you never see actually or experience the thing that is creating, right, those shadows. So all I see of people is their interactions with the world. It's that barrier, or that blanket is the only experience that I have of others. And then I have my own internal makeup. And as you said, my own musings about myself, about my own consciousness. And as a Buddhist, and I heard you in one of your talks say, I don't remember exactly if it was, and that's why enlightenment is not possible, or that's why there's probably no enlightenment. I found that interesting as a Buddhist myself, having gone to, my wife and I did a bachelor's degree in India at an international institute, which is also a monastery. So there are about 45 monks that live there, and we are 25 foreigners. And we had a mix of traditional monastic, Tibetan monastic teachings, where certain books we read over 2 years, line by line, with commentary from our teachers, right? And a very exhaustive philosophical exploration of the teachings of Tibetan Buddhism. So that'd be more the emic perspective on it. And we had Western academic teachers on the history of Buddhism, on methodologies, on language, and whatnot. And we had to sit with the emic versus the etic view on a lot of these topics. And I have to say credit to the monks who came from a purely monastic background and suddenly were exposed to, well, there's a different way that you can interpret not only this philosophy, but also some of the actions and the history of it. But would that mean that if indeed consciousness, our experience of it, is just within our generative model and sits potentially in a part of our brain, that therefore what Buddhists see as recognizing the nature of one's own mind as enlightenment would not be something which would exist outside of my own interoceptive experience of myself?
I can't answer that, and I'm sure I've never said that you can't experience enlightenment. So
Okay.
you are clearly reading something in which is important. Could you define enlightenment for me and the viewers?
Oh my, I don't want to say afraid that you would ask that question, but when the Buddha explains enlightenment, he explains what it is not, to the point that you can only know it if you experience it. And in that sense, the recognition of, the way I understand it, and I hope some of my Buddhist friends and my monk friends will listen to this and call me afterwards and tell me that I was not wrong, but that they'll help me. Um, so there was, let me try and think who it was. One of the great Buddhist philosophers said, form is emptiness, emptiness is form melts into emptiness, and emptiness melts into form. It's like there's some sort of canvas on which matter or experience, manifests itself, and those two are one and the same. The manifestation and the canvas sort of melt into one another in that sense. And recognizing the nature of one's own mind and enlightenment would be the experience. And that's why the Buddha used negatives, because not experience is how we understand human experience, but it would be the realization of that nature of form and emptiness being one and the same, and then operating in this existence and in this plane with that kind of realization and experience. I don't know what my friends are going to say about that explanation, but it's the best that I can do.
I was, I think I'm partly there, but I'm sure I haven't quite got the profundity or the essence of it. Um, I mean, I think the closest that one would get um, from the point of view of the physics of sentience that the free energy principle brings to the table um, is a suspension of attention to the sensorium,
Hmm.
um, and possibly even a relaxation of prior beliefs that um, constitute the layered structure, the hierarchical structure, so that you are if what a clinician would call in an internal attention state, so that there is a relaxation of prior beliefs and convictions just to update your beliefs in the absence of any evidence, and in a way that relaxes any formal constraints such that you can explore the full latitude and uncertainty of, or the full latitude of various hypotheses about self and being in the absence of sensations. So in my world, experience is a loaded term, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
reading experience as basically belief updating on the inside,
Mm-hmm.
whereas sensations are the thing that drive the shadows on the Plato's cave, for example,
Mm-hmm.
or impressions upon my retina, would be things that can drive that experience as a process of belief updating. But they don't have to. If I close my eyes or I go to sleep, I sequester myself from the sensorium neurochemically during certain deep sleep stages. And if you're a skilled meditator, then by focusing on one particular sensory modality, say
Mm-hmm.
breathing, for example, then you can implicitly minimize the precision on the prediction errors of all others and put yourself in an internal attention state or an attentional set that would be equivalent to divorcing yourself from the sensorium. So it may be that kind of enlightenment, the enlightenment you describe
Mm-hmm.
could be an emergent property of sense making on the inside,
Mm-hmm.
but under very special conditions. And I would imagine it would take, oh, in fact, I know it takes
Years.
decades of
Yeah.
skillful practice to be able to control your attention or your precision in that kind of way to
Mm-hmm.
get into these states. I'm still not quite sure about the sort of the more form from
Form melts in emptiness is form, form is emptiness. Yeah.
yeah, that's.
I'm trying to think if that was. I'll have to
I am
remember.
not. I'm not a scholar in Buddhism, so I'll have to go away and think about the mathematical little
Well, I think
basis.
if you know, I think it's Daniel Hoffman, if I'm not mistaken,
Donald
who's
Hoffman, is that?
yes, thank you, Donald Hoffman, right?
Yeah,
Who
yeah.
says in a talk that he's trying to prove with his students mathematically that you and I can be one consciousness, but experiencing ourselves as separate. And I know that I think he is either very inclined to Buddhist. He's been meditating for many years, and I think he's very inclined to Buddhism. So it's a thing also about that my own or whatever consciousness is more than just located within my own interoceptive or physical body, and I think that would also, and there are actually like many schools of Tibetan philosophy, which people don't know about, because if you get into stuff like karma, so where do the seeds of the actions that you take reside for them to then mature later, right? In the future, in some philosophical schools, they see something called a base consciousness, and the seeds live in there, and then you incarnate physically, and those seeds can mature. In other Buddhist philosophies, no, they occur in the moment based on the conditions, and they're not stored. So there's a lot of variation also in Tibetan Buddhism in terms of how they try to, or how they explain how these things work. And I'm obviously not scholared enough to go into all of that, but yeah, obviously I was just curious because I heard something to that effect and something that you were saying. I didn't remember exactly. Yeah, I don't think that you had said that it's not possible, right, as such. But I wanted to, as we talked about consciousness and agency, out of personal curiosity, to ask you about enlightenment, which is not an easy and question to just answer or talk about in a short period of time. Um,
Well,
and
before you
yes,
move
please.
on to the next theme, yeah, it might be useful to get Donald Hoffman on this interview series, and so there's lots of if you like common commitments between his philosophy or approach to
Hmm.
um, being, and the free energy principle. Very simple things like aspiring, as does people like, as does people like Chris Fields, to a background-free kind of sense making. Where there is no space time. These are just constructs that we bring to the table,
Hmm.
and they can be easily dissolved in certain sort of perceptual states. So it'd be interesting, I think, to get him to answer your question about enlightenment. He was slightly more informed. The other person you might want to speak to is Thomas Metzinger, who
Okay.
is now really driving hard at what I suspect is very close to the enlightenment you describe,
Mm.
which he casts in terms of an MPE, which is a minimal phenomenal experience.
Mm.
What is left after everything else has gone away. So this is non-dual awareness. So it's a kind of emptiness, I think, that you were intimating that
Hmm.
underwrites enlightenment. So he's trying to understand this minimal phenomenal experience that has no selfhood. It has nothing. Just to get at the essence of it. So he also, I think, has a fairly deep and scholarly understanding of sort of Eastern philosophy and Buddhist, um, 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 both in experience and reading. So he might be somebody who you would enjoy talking to, and probably get a much more sensible answer than you'll get from me. Yes.
No, I think your answer is very sensible, and it looked at it from the perspective of the free energy principle, and also of the brain and neurology, and what you know and what we know about the experience of self and consciousness and these things. But as you said, our generative model allows certain people to go, into this world of what ifs and whys and wheres, and so that's another way, or not another way, but I'm curious to also, then I will definitely try and reach out to them and see if they'd be open to have a discussion and to see where they are on their understanding, experimentation, and hypotheses. And well, none of us really know until the moment where we're no longer here to potentially say anything about that experience. So the rest is just hypotheses, best guess, and the research that we can do with the tools that we have. Um, and who knows where our understanding will be in 50, 100 years, 200 years. I don't know if you've ever heard of, and probably, like, cosmological polytropes. I read random things, but that we have geometric shapes that can now explain when you push two particles together and they explode, and the patterns that come out of it. Mathematically, we don't have the computational power to come up with a formula that explains every possible outcome, but we have geometric shapes that encompass every single outcome that we've been able to measure. And it seems that geometry plays some very, at least the concept that we have created and called geometry, let's put it that way, right, of the physical world that we live in. So maybe we'll know stuff in, for sure, in 50, 100, 200 years, which we don't know today. And the best we can do is just be curious about it for now, and listen to different people and what they know and how far they've gotten with their experiments and understanding.
Yeah, you should speak to Stephen Wolfram about his Rulliard with this geometry
Oh,
and
okay.
um, but certainly, geometry, I think, from the perspective of the energy principle, is central. You could articulate the free energy principle purely in terms of information geometry.
Oh, well.
Just for your interest,
Yeah.
an information geometry is a special kind of geometry you get when you're dealing with the space of beliefs, where
Okay.
beliefs are read as probability distributions. So it would be the geometry of inference and experience, reading experience as measurement, and measurement as inference, building beliefs with greater or lesser certainty about this or that,
Hmm.
usually about sensory measurements or sensations, or shadows on Plato's cave. Um, so this is a special, and I think probably the only really interesting kind of geometry. And any generative model that you bring to the table will have an implicit information geometry. So your statement that in a few hundred years' time we'll have a deeper understanding of ourselves and our universe, I think is
Hmm.
literally true. We will have brains whose information geometry is now optimized in relation to being a good model of this lived universe,
Hmm.
and everything that we make within it. Because practically, you start off by saying, well, it's good to minimize surprise because you're minimizing free energy, and that's like efficient. Um, um, you can actually articulate that purely in terms of the information geometry, because when you update your prior beliefs to your posterior beliefs through this process of Bayesian belief updating, which
Hmm.
I would contend is the process of consciousness.
Hmm.
Um, you're moving on this in this geometry, technically a physical manifold. So because this is a space of beliefs, when I change my prior belief to my posterior belief, I move.
Hmm.
So belief updating is movement in this geometry. Consciousness is a trajectory or a process that moves through this geometry. And this geometry is defined by a metric. So it's defined by the distance that I move as I do my belief updating and I evince my conscious process. Um, and interesting, the metric is the precision we were talking about before, which is the seat of Mark Solmes's explanation for
For
consciousness.
consciousness. Hmm.
So the degree to which you move depends upon the precision of the beliefs themselves. Um, so this is the metric. So in a very simple sense, it's also known statistics as the Fisher information metric. You can actually measure it, and it just boils down to the the precision of your beliefs. So if you want to take that to enlightenment, and if I am correct that enlightenment is essentially a relaxation of priors so that they all have very, very low precision. That basically means collapsing your information geometry
Hmm.
to a point, which might be the kind of emptiness. I'm not sure about this,
Hmm.
but I'll have to go away and think about it. But just to reinforce the notion of geometry,
Yes.
it's just a description of spaces equipped with a metric. What is the right kind of metric to talk about consciousness and our understanding of the world? Well, it's a metric of beliefs, and
Hmm.
that basically tells you you're working in an information geometry, and you are and have an information geometry. And just to come back to the free energy resolution of Cartesian dualism,
Hmm.
uh, we often talk about an intrinsic and extrinsic information geometry. So the extrinsic one is the information geometry that is described by a movement of beliefs about the world in the belief updating sense we were just talking about, that
Yeah.
may be present for consciousness processes or conscious processing. Um, Whereas the intrinsic geometry is literally the thermodynamics, if you like, of the physical neuronal activity. That also
Hmm.
has information geometry, and
Yep.
that's what electrophysiologists would normally commit to.
Very nice. A lot to wrap my physical brain and my conscious mind around. But yeah, I mean, it's the idea of geometry and also the structure of the brain, right? I imagine, and I think there is research around this. Um, Great meditators, be it His Holiness the Dalai Lama or other yogis, have also a different, not only information geometry, but that's coupled with a different brain structure, like physical geometry, I imagine, in the interworkings, right, of their physical brains. How does what we know about the human brain, the free energy principle, how does that now move into, and it may seem out there, to artificial intelligence? And actually, I believe that you are involved, and I know that your free energy principle or is being used as a generative model, yeah, within the space of artificial intelligence. I've had recent conversations with different friends, some who say are very afraid of artificial intelligence in the future going potentially rogue on its own and what that could mean for us. And of course, there's a question of ethics and who's creating the models, and what do they have as their models as they create the models. And I have another friend who was saying, well, Eric, I mean, you put boundaries. It's a system. You put boundaries on its, sort of capabilities, what it can or can't do, and it can't just go rogue and create more versions of itself, or take over the world, all on its own. Um, can you share a little bit about your view, how the free energy principle is moving, or is already, or has been, in the space of artificial intelligence? And what is your feeling or your understanding of where the risks lie, if any, and should we or should we not be concerned, or what should we be using as potential guardrails as we move forward with the development of artificial intelligence?
Yeah, that's a question we could spend another hour talking about, but we can't. So I'll try and get through those issues very quickly. I cut to the denouement. I'm with your second friend, that your guardrails are naturally part of applying the free energy principle to a self-organizing ecosystem of intelligence, or a distributed cognition amongst interacting agents, or interactive inference. And I'll just motivate that technically for those people who like the physics of this. So the free energy principle is dual to something called the constrained maximum entropy principle of James, who was a great mathematician and physicist who, who identified the fundaments of how we measure the universe. And the key thing I want to pick up on is it's a constrained entropy maximization. The entropy we're talking about now is exactly the entropy of our beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to maximize the entropy, you want to minimize the precision. So you're talking about letting everything happen, keeping your options open in terms of your commitments. And that's what I'm assuming is the enlightenment, the aspiration of an enlightened state.
Mm-hmm.
So that's written into the physics of measurement, the physics of under the maximum entropy principle, also things like Occam's principle. But
Mm-hmm.
the key thing here is under constraints. Where did the constraints come from? They come from the generative model. They
Mm-hmm.
are the things that supply the surprise that allows you to be constrained. So the guardrails are the surprise. It is a surprise. Well, the surprise that is um, embodied by your prior beliefs in your generative model that are
Mm-hmm.
themselves learned. So, for free, when you apply the free energy principle to artificial intelligence research, and that's usually done by applying active inference to a particular problem, because
Yeah.
normally um, artificial intelligence is well, it can be read just basically as just sense making and generating content. There's no agency there. So, for example, large language models and
Yeah.
chatbots and the like. Um, that kind of artificial intelligence does not require agency and does not really require active inference. But you
Mm-hmm.
can sort of just switch off the action and apply sort of variational principles in the usual way, leading things like variation autoencoders. But the more interesting application for artificial intelligence is active inference, and the meme here is that in fact it's not artificial intelligence you want, it's natural intelligence. And
Mm-hmm.
what you'll get if you apply active inference to artificial intelligence is natural intelligence. What is natural? It's self-evidencing. It's a kind of agency and decision making and generative AI that is trying to render its world as mutually as predictable and sympathetic as possible. So again, there's no very much like you were saying before. There's no right and wrong. There
Mm-hmm.
is no objective function. It's not how many paper clips can I make, how much money can I make. That's irrelevant. The only thing that matters for any artificial or natural intelligence is the evidence for its implicit world model
Mm-hmm.
inherent in its exchanges with everything else. And of course, everything else could include other intelligent artifacts and other human beings. And that brings me to the next step, that many of the applications of active inference in this setting are really concerned with interaction or interactive inference between different agents that may or may not have similar generative models, and then
Mm-hmm.
starting to think about the joint free energy minimization in an ecosystem or ensemble of different agents. And again, you get the guardrails in place, not because you're writing down some explicit constraints, although that would certainly be necessary if you read the constraints as defining the prize that people scaffold the generative models, but simply because the objective is just to minimize free energy, minimize surprise, minimize catastrophes, minimize singularities, minimize paperclip, minimize the possibility of the paperclip factory paradox. Simply because the objective function is mutual predictability. So what you're looking at is a natural prescription, if you commit to application of free energy principle to natural intelligence that is distributed in the right kind of ecosystem, you are applying the kind of principles that describe self-organization, self-evidencing of things that are self-sustaining and
Mhm.
self-modeling, and that have a generalized synchrony that, from the point of view of you know the AI ethics, would be exactly the ambitions that you would want to avoid catastrophic surprises or a failure to sustain, either in the sense of some climate change and the like,
Mhm.
or in terms of um, violation of social norms, or contravening moral or other kinds of ways of describing how the system evolves. So I would be with your second friend. The guardrails are there. This is you can read self-evidencing as entropy maximization under constraints, and you
Mhm.
have an operational definition of what those constraints are in terms of the priors that the generative model brings to the table. But remember, those priors are learnable because you can update them in the way we're describing. How
Mhm.
are they learned? They're learned in the context of interacting with other agents. What's the imperative here? Minimize expected surprise, learn about the other person, and try to converge upon a shared generative model so that you are mutually predictable. So what you will see if you commit to that application is, in principle, I don't know if it's going to happen in practice, but in principle, uh, uh, you know, a distributed egosyntonic kind of sympathetic interaction that has a joint free energy minima, if it can be realized.
Does that mean, because if I understood correctly, you said so AI plus the free energy principle equals natural intelligence? Yeah, like largely. If w-
Yeah, but perhaps biomimetic. Yeah.
okay, but because like if we operate as humans under the free energy principle, we are capable of great goodness and great harm. Yeah, both are biological possibilities which we have seen, yeah, and we see being enacted. Um, would the same be possible within an artificial intelligence which is um, given a generative model of using the free energy principle, which resembles a lot our own, um, let's say, uh, way of working, and the way that we are as biological beings? Would that not potentially open up the door for just as much those two possibilities? That's a AI, free energy principle, natural intelligence could do great good, or depending what it's exposed to and how it updates its priors and what model it wants to confirm within, yeah, itself and its own predictions, that the other side is also possible that it could do great harm.
Um, Yes, I mean, when you start using words like good and bad and harm, I have to
Yeah.
sort of translate them in what do they mean from the point of view of the physics of self-organization, and basically what they usually end up meaning is a high degree of surprisal or surprise. So
Okay.
the system has got itself into a state which is very uncharacteristic. So
Right.
it's very surprising to find it in that state. Um, and what that basically means is a failure to remain on your attracting set or to maintain a non-equilibrium steady state. So all of
Hmm.
these words like bad and harm and the like, they just mean basically surprising states of affairs. That usually means a failure of a sustainable attracting set of characteristic states. So you say people are.
Sorry, if I may interrupt. Sorry, does that apply to people too? In a sense, if I think of war and violence and physical harm, would you apply that to people as well? That means that we
Yes,
have experienced a state of surprise, which is
yes.
so large that this is the um, what happens in those cases.
Yeah, no, in fact, I was exactly thinking about that. I was actually thinking
Okay.
about the Ukraine war, in fact. And, just this is a bit morbid, and you may want to cut this out, but, my point here is that people who engage with war don't
Yes.
exist very long. They get killed.
Mm.
Yeah. So when you say there are bad actors, yes, there are, but how long do they last?
Mm.
So, from the physicist's point of view, that's what I meant by they are no longer in characteristic states of being, or they are too far away from the attracting set that defines the characteristic states of a person, for example, um,
Ah.
to be
Okay.
sustainable. So they were even dictators, autocratic dictators. It may take decades, but ultimately they're not. They cannot be sustained.
Mm.
So people who fight and who um, you know tried who are bad actors towards their conspecifics generally aren't there after a few hours, months, years, or decades. So that's what I meant by from the point of view of physics, badness or bad actors is just things that don't survive. They don't have
Hmm.
an adaptive fitness in relation to. So that could certainly happen. And then you have to ask yourself, what would a bad actor look like in some biomimetic artificial intelligence in the future? It would look like a little war, probably a commercial war. So very
Okay.
much like, say, iPhone destroying BlackBerry, and the forces will not be atom bombs or power cuts, or it won't be Terminator like science fiction. They will be market forces. People are just not going to buy this thing because it makes too many paperclips.
Mm.
You know, and so this is if you like. I'm not saying this is the teleology. Well, in fact, I am. What I'm saying is it can't be any other way. If we're going to exist in an ecosystem that invites in and in a sustainable way intelligent artifacts that are not biological, it has to be the case that ultimately they will be part of this joint free energy minimization,
Mm.
and there will be some candidates that do not survive and will be rejected, and then you can describe that in terms of wars, in terms of singularities, in terms of catastrophes, or in terms of just failure of product market fit. And I suspect it's a failure of product market fit, which is kind of the most natural way of describing where the bad actors go. So it's in that sense that I have a much more sanguine. I take your second friend's position there, and there will be all sorts of different ways of reading this, and glorious blogs and horror stories. But ultimately, it's just going to describe what will be around in the future that in terms of artifacts with a biomimetic intelligence are just those things that we find really useful and predictable,
Mm.
and enhance our ecostructure. Um, I should also say that a lot of this artificial intelligence of a biomimetic sort will not be necessarily like us, in the same way that our current ecosystem has lots of agents in it, ranging from viruses through to governments. Yeah.
Mm.
So the same thing is likely to happen, I think, with artificial intelligence, that we'll have lots of sort of small intelligent artifacts on the edge.
Hmm.
We've already got them. We
Yeah.
already have them. Sort of like, iPhones and thermostats and the like. They're already here. They're already part of our ecosystem. I don't think there's going to be any sort of phase transition or breakthrough that's going to change that, unless it's be a pure marketing thing. So we've already got these biomimetic artifacts in play. And we have had for many years, since people introduced thermostats into radiators, for example. And then we're likely to have things that manage our worldwide webs in the way that we do mental action and attention, that may be larger than us. And then we'll have sort of helper robots and autonomous vehicles and the like, will be the same kind of size as us, and they'll be more and more anthropomorphic. My point here is that intelligence can exist at all different scales. A virus has a certain minimal kind of intelligence and engages in a very potent, very self-sustaining active inference.
Mm-hmm.
We may not like it, but that's part of our ecosystem, and it keeps our immune systems tuned. There are ways of living together.
Yeah.
That it can only be like that, and from the point of view of the free energy principle, there is no difference between a virus and an intelligent artifact on the edge. Well, perhaps virus is wrong, because that causes symptoms. Between there's no difference between let's say, for example, having a symbiotic pet, having
Mm-hmm.
a goldfish, or
Yeah.
having a dog, and
Yeah.
having a rumba or some artificial helper of that low level. And again, it's probably going to be driven by market forces. So
Mm-hmm.
are you going to buy an artificial intelligence that's going to take over the world? Probably not.
No. And I think, to your point, I was reading an author recently who said that we should look at technology and artificial intelligence as how do we build, I mean, a partnership, in a sense of, and to the free energy principle, let's say dynamics, right? How do we, let's see them as something that will become something that is trying to self-actualize its own model of the world, and that we're trying to do the same thing, rather than building something that we're trying to control and sort of um, I would say use as another resource, like we've done with our planet, because that hasn't gone very well for us in the way that we've understood that relationship. To a large extent, we seem to, at least the people that I listen to and that I find interesting, we have decoupled ourselves a lot from this idea of relationships within the world in which we exist. We try to put a value on nature now, as if we can exchange carbon here with carbon there, or trees here with trees there, and where these relationships are just fundamental to um, fundamental to this experience that we have, and the beauty and the um, let's say where we should be spending a lot of our time is looking at those relationships. And the same thing as we go forward with AI, it's not just about the technology and what it's going to do, but it's really about understanding and spending time on the relationship between us,
Yes.
between them and the environment. Someone I spoke to recently, her name is Dori Tunstall. She was the first Black dean of a design school anywhere. She was the dean of OCAD University in Canada. And she talked about, from a business perspective, stakeholders has to go all the way to the person who's mining the cobalt that we use in our devices. And it's all about relationships and expanding the way that we look at not only the problems that we have, but the solutions that we have, and to be very much less simplistic in the way that we approach these things. But then there's marketing, as you mentioned, which sometimes throws a monkey wrench into trying to complexify things and look at them in terms of relationships. Um, that was a little bit out there, but those are the connections that came to mind as you shared where AI is, most probably going to go. One thing that I like to ask, sort of ending my conversations with my guests, is um, what do you think that we could do better or differently as a human species to be kinder, more just, more compassionate, and maybe more aligned, let's say, in our self organizing equilibrium, to have, um, hopefully a more harmonious state or society that we live in? Does the free energy principle, does your work, does your experience also in psychiatry inform you in any way that you can impart some of that with us? And how can we build a more kind and compassionate and harmonious society as we go forward?
I think you have just answered that question by focusing on relationships. Um, so, from the point of view of the physics of self-organization and sentient self-organization, what that means is a special focus on the relationships between things that are demarcated by their boundaries or their Markov blankets. And those boundaries or Markov blankets rest upon a delicate and beautiful and sparse dependency on relationship structure. So what that means is, in terms of engineering sustainability of a distributed kind of intelligent interactions amongst all our conspecifics and all the artifacts that we bring to the table, then the focus should be on the relationships, and in particular, the fine graining and nurturing of boundaries at multiple scales, that and identifying those things that could potentially destroy those boundaries. And the destruction of boundaries can be read in many, many different ways. It can be read as cancer, where certain cells outgrow their boundaries and destroy the Markov blankets that that would be necessary for you to have a physiology and anatomy with clearly defined organs. They can be read as boundaries of a geopolitical sort. So, the invasion of one country by another country is a disruption of that separation, that sparse connectivity that defines a boundary between one country and another country. One thing which I think that is undercuts all of these different conceptualizations or different scales where you can apply the concept of Markov blankets or boundaries and boundaries in a scale-free session is the danger of overconnectivity. It's the danger of trying to globalize. So if you
Mm.
globalize, you coarse grain. If you coarse grain, you introduce lots of dependencies that destroy all the Markov blankets. So,
Mm.
just if you like, heuristically, what that means is you should be focusing on your next door neighbor
Yeah.
and your family and friends. You should not be worried about what's happening in the global markets or in terms of tensions between the East and the West. You should really be focused. So news, social media is, I think, a real danger here, because
Mm.
that tends to take your eye off what really matters, which is your relationships and your what individuates you from the things around you. You get that right, everything else will be self-sustainable. But if you now start to be exposed to social media where things are just either good or bad,
Mhm.
then you're losing a lot of that finesse and sparsity and ability to infer what's going to happen next, and indeed represent and understand what happens next. And the symptoms of this are things, like polarization. So
Mm.
no longer can you be have political leanings in this direction that are nuanced by convictions to this particular morality or ethics. You're either blue or you're red
You're
on
red.
that side. So it's a dyslexia of being
Mm.
that is fueled by a lack of um, delicate relationships and over connectivity. So that's what I would say in terms of, how can we make ourselves kinder and more sympathetic? We just need to understand ourselves and make ourselves mutually predictable. And that means basically having a fine grained model of you, and
Mm.
you as my next door neighbor, basically, as opposed to you being some canonical representative of a particular ideology or theology.
Mm. Well, thank you for sharing it. Yeah, I think that's very beautiful. In this global society, my wife and I, so I'm originally from Canada, she's from Russia, and we live in Germany. We are somehow connected to all kinds of people across the world, but not very much to our neighbors. Very often, we don't have that sense of community, right? And the neighbors that we get to know, and that with whom we build these strong relationships just person to person, as opposed to now having social media. And I was just thinking, as you were saying, that my priors are now getting updated by social media, like to the nth degree, that suddenly I may meet someone and they say, oh, I'm this, or I follow this candidate. And then what is in my head as potential priors is everything that I've seen on social media about everything that supposedly goes with that, with being a candidate or supporting this candidate or that candidate. Whereas human to human, neighbor to neighbor relationships, community gardens, things that we used to have, right? And building that and predictability and knowing one another, um, I think clearly builds peace and compassion and understanding. And it's something that I hope that we'll all take to heart in spending the time to get to know our neighbors and to build that community. Karl Friston, thank you very, very much for your time. If people want to find out more, they can YouTube you. There's a lot there that they can learn about the free energy principle. Is there anything else or where you would direct people if they want to learn more?
No. Just to congratulate you on a really nice way of closing this session. It's been a great pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.